that big event is the anniversary today, marking a year since the July unrest that swept through KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng provinces. The unrest, believed to have been sparked off by the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma for contempt of court, caused widespread looting of shops and businesses, leading to the deaths of over 300 people. SABC News reporters Ayanda Mhlongo, Simphiwe Makhanya and Vusi Khumalo are covering the story and now joins us live. We start with you, Simphiwe. What's the latest? What's happening where you are?
Indeed, Desiree, good morning to you and good morning to the viewers of the agenda at home. We continue with this rolling coverage, of course, reflecting on some of the events which unfolded in July last year, when we saw the worst riots which took place in the history of the country's democracy. And of course, Desiree, we have been speaking to various stakeholders as we look back on this day, and we are now joined by the MEC for Economic Development in KwaZulu-Natal, MEC Ravi Pillay. Mr. Pillay, looking at where we are, perhaps just to kick off the conversation, the destruction is still very much visible in the province of KwaZulu-Natal.
No, indeed. Good morning, and good morning to your viewers. Thank you for having us. Indeed, that is so, but I think the overwhelming message is that we are rebuilding. We've made significant progress. We are hard at work, and that we are convinced that there's such a massive goodwill by all stakeholders that we will be back on, beyond where we were in a very short space of time. Not only are we rebuilding, as you're seeing this physical building being reconstructed, and that's happened across the whole province. Yes, there is a backlog of recovery, but we've still had significant new investment coming in, and that tells us that as a province, we are a strategic province for various reasons. We are a preferred investment destination for various reasons, and that there is confidence which we've got to continue to build, that KZN will continue to be a major economic space. Of course, we are the second biggest in population in the country. We're also the second biggest in GDP contribution. Our two harbors, Durban and Richards Bay, take 60% of our imports and exports into the country. The N3 and N2 are major arterial roads. But beyond those hard competitive advantages, we think the people of KwaZulu-Natal have the ability to rise. We've always played a leading role, and we think we will continue to do so, both economically and otherwise.
In terms of your assessment, MEC Pillay, for looking at the extent of the damage in monetary value, how much has the province of KwaZulu-Natal lost as a result of the unrest?
Well, we're still by and large working on the figures that have been in the public domain, which says that nationally 50 billion rand, of which at least 30 billion was in KZN. And as we go along, of course, as more reports and quantification comes in, we think that number will increase. For instance, that number generally described the physical infrastructure. Of course, you then start to take fixtures, fittings, you start to take the stock that was in businesses, and then of course you take the loss of business over a period of time that businesses have been closed. So when you take all those factors of quantification, then the numbers are going to rise. But another good indication is that if you take off the insurance claims that were submitted and settled, and these figures might be about 2 months old, I think it was about 23 billion rand of claims that were made in terms of Sastria, and at that time 15 billion had been paid. I believe that has risen now to about 80% of claims. So that gives you an indication, backed by evidence as to the scale of the damage. But as I said, I think eventually the quantification will require a very careful exercise. Insurance claims also tend to have a little bit of an exaggeration factor, because you try to get as much as you can, and then of course they are subjected to engineering and actuarial calculations before you determine the precise amount. But whatever that final figure is, it's a big knock, and we are having to recover from that.
bringing in my colleague Ayanda Mhlongo. Ayanda, the MEC talking about the province rebuilding, but of course the issue of investor confidence is going to be very crucial for those businesses that may want to rebuild their businesses in these different operations.
Well, absolutely, and I think as the MEC was saying, apart from the structural damage, and this would also be my question to the MEC, we've done the assessment, we've seen the damage to properties, both private and public, but the damage to people's lives, I think must be of great importance. We're looking at a mall of the size, the biggest mall that services the Ink area, Ntuzuma, Kwamashu, and I was just looking at going through the stores here, 33 stores alone were clothing and footwear stores, and I can just imagine the number of people that were employed in this mall. My question then is, in speaking with business and in your engagement with business, are these people going to get their jobs back? Are people who lost their jobs, are you certain? Have you had that commitment from government? Because these are the questions that people are saying to us, that in hindsight, we can now see the extent of the damage, but we now need jobs, given, of course, the current economic climate.
No, absolutely. I think if I can, the one Edendale just jumps into my head, right? Because I went into detail there. And in that particular case, Edendale is in Pietermaritzburg, the Edendale Mall. I remember the figure was 2,000 jobs. 2,000 jobs, direct and indirect, around the mall. So the numbers were horrific. The good news from the big companies was a very early commitment not to dismiss anyone. And then they redeployed them to other branches, or they found creative ways to keep them in employment. And we think that was a good business decision, but it was also a good display of a patriotic commitment. I think it would be unfair to expect that to happen for the small players, the small businesses. But even there, we've seen significant recovery, and we think those jobs are back. At the moment, I see the Durban Chamber has put out a figure. There's still 9,000 jobs at risk, because those which might not come back. We think that's counterbalanced by the new investments we've had along the whole range, and the Premier will be giving a detailed statement later today covering the damage, the recovery, the investments, and a whole range of issues. I don't want to steal his thunder in releasing some of those statistics. But the bottom line to your question, yes, there were jobs at risk. We've recovered significantly. Big business made that commitment. They've honored that particular commitment. There are still jobs at risk, but we think that's counterbalanced by the new investments that we're having. In fact, of all the big players, almost all committed to rebuilding and are rebuilding. I think there's only one that decided at the moment to expand its Johannesburg operation to cater for its distribution needs, but even there the engagements are ongoing as for them to re-establish, and that we think is a very positive message.
Well, MEC, let's pause this conversation and welcome our colleague Vusi Khumalo, who is going to tell us what is happening where he's at. Vusi, it's over to you.
Yes, Simphiwe, good morning to you as well as the viewers. Early this morning, we are here at Umlazi, south of Durban. Let me just, without further ado, step out of the shot. For someone who doesn't know this area, Mapoloba Utulango, our old hands, is showing you the area known as KwaZulu-Natal, a wholesale center. This used to be a hustle and bustle of Umlazi, with a huge economic spin-offs bringing to Umlazi. It used to be one of the biggest shopping centers here at Umlazi. In terms of the traffic count, from Billboard finder.co.za, they are saying that in terms of the traffic, in the number of steps or the pedestrian count, it used to be 25,000 per day. So that tells you exactly how many people used to frequent this area in order to get services from this shopping or a center here. And in terms of the traffic by the cars now, there used to be like 30,000 to 60,000 per day. So that tells you the number of cars that used to pass through here, so that some of the locals and also people even from areas such as Ispingo, Umlazi, south of Durban, Galleria, Amanzimtoti, and all other township sections, because Umlazi is one of the biggest townships, if I'm not mistaken. It's after Soweto, with a number of people, more than 1 million people who are residing here at Umlazi. So during the unrest in July, this was one of the hot spots. It was the looters then destroyed this area, and it suffered a huge structural damage. As you can see, as Mapoloba Ungobo is showing you, you may be forgiven to think that this was not one of the busiest. It was a hub of activity at the time, just before the unrest that took place last year on this very week. As a number of other shops were looted here to Umlazi, but this one suffered hugely. As I'm talking to you, I'm going to ask again our camera person Mapoloba just to show you the number of hawkers and also some stalls that have been almost left abandoned due to the fact that there's no longer traffic here in this area. It is resembling a ghost town, as you can see. We are going to speak to two of the hawkers or the street vendors who have been left with no other option but to stay here and try to sell some of their products. As you can see, they are selling fruits and vegetables as well, and some chickens are being sold here. But we have been talking to them. They are saying that the business has been disrupted because of the Kwachi now wholesale center is no more. We do not know for certain whether the investor will come back in this area because the business was left destroyed. Let us invite two of the hawkers so that we can get from the horse's mouth, so that we can see. Mama Jekafushane is igama nesibongo njengoba ushilo uthandiwe Chiliza. Awusitshele mama ukuthi nje ngokuhamba kwaleli business nina njengabadayisi lapha nakhahlameze kangakanani?
Ngokuhamba kukwenzeka kwalento sakhahlamezeka kakhulu, ungangoba sathola imali sakwazi ukukhona kwenza izinto sasizenza. Kwa sewusebenzela nje ukuthi kudliwe endlini, asakwazi ukudlala idokufela zethu, sakwazi ukuhamba siyikhiphe ngendlela abantu abazikhiphayo babaphumuza emoyeni. Sesinto nje hlala nje iququbele.
Ngoyisimo sokudayisa ke manje ngoba uyasitshela ngaphambilini ukuthi abantu bebebaningi la bedlule bethenga.
Yebo, abantu bebebaningi. Lesi sitolo sinayo yonke into, lesi sitolo into ebengekho kusona. Buye eThekwini ngobuthanda. Bebebaningi ngalendlela ukuthi bebethenga abantu la babe bangena esitolo babuye bazothatha kuthini impahla. Bayathenga kuthini. Besupporta futhi abantu bakithi bebasemlazi. Imvamisa umlazi obuthenga lana. Osowufile ngalesitolo nathi sifile ngoba ama customers afika.
Okay, siyabonga mama. Let's speak to another one now and see if we can talk to her. Mam Chiliza was saying that as some of the hawkers they've impacted negatively by the closure of this wholesale center next to them. Mama kafushane nje umama ubalungile Ngcobo, awusitsheleke mama ukuthi mhlambe nina yini enithembile ke nje manje ngoba nisasele la, siyanibona niyazama ukuhlanganisa njengoba lesitolo singasekho sinikhahlameze kakhulu, kunikhahlameze kakhulu kangakanani ukuthi mhlambe ubona sinjani isolution noma isixazululo kuludaba enibhekene nalo?
Asikho isixazululo kule nkinga esibhekene nayo. Isixazululo nje ukuthi kubuye isitolo ukuze sikwazi ukuphila, ngoba njengamanje asikwazi ukuphila, sihluleka ikona konke. Engangokuba nje sinezingane ezifunda ezinye zibekile esikoleni ngenxa ukuthi asinayo imali yokugibela, besibagibelisa abantwana besikoleni. Asisakwazi ukugibelisa abantwana, sikhethe ukuthi abayeke bame silinde isitolo size sivule ukuze sikwazi ukuqhubeka nempilo. Njengamanje asikwazi kwenza lutho, sisebenzela ukuthi sithole isinkwa kuphela. Abantu abekho abazothenga njengamanje.
Kade nisho ngaphambilini ukuthi niyarenta la imali engakanani nokuthi ama profits ke manje kunina ashayeke kangakanani?
Ama profit ashayeke kakhulu, asikwazi ngisho ukukhokhela izitolo, simile ukukhokhela izitolo, izikwelete besinazo, yonke into nje imile into efudinga imali. Akula kusebenze ukuthi nje mawuthola isinkwa ubonga, mawuthole isinkwa kuphela njengamanje, kanti besikwazi thina besisebenza singenankinga, ingane zethu bezifunda ngayo le mali ebhizinisi, besilenta 1200 kamasipala, kodwa futhi ubungasindi ngendlela bekusebenzeka ngayo. Njengamanje usuyasinda, sisakwazi ukukhokha.
Ngama profits kumi kanjani ngoba ngaphambilini bengakanani njengamanje asenjani?
Ngaphambilini mhlambe bekwenzeka udayise 2.5 a day, njengamanje akuhlangana ngisho 500, awukwazi ukuhlanganisa njengamanje. Kubheda kakhulu njengasemalini, futhi ayikho into esizothi siyakhalisa, siyakhala abantu ibona abangekho, futhi nathi siyabona bazothi mabeza bazothi bayaphila ngoba isitolo asikho, thina besiphila ngesitolo lesi sakajini.
Siyabonga kakhulu. That Umam Mngcobo saying that the closure of the Gina wholesale center has forced them to live from hand to mouth. As you can see, it is still closed. It was vandalized by the looters here at Umlazi. So they are saying that they are no longer able to support their families as a result of the closure of this shop. They are saying that it's very difficult. The business, sometimes they used to now make profit of 500 rand, but before the unrest, they used to make profit of more than 2,400, and they are renting this facility, these stalls, of which they are renting 1,200 rand, and they are no longer able to afford renting out this place. Well, let me get back to Ayanda Mhlongo, who is one of the reporters who reported also massively on the July unrest. Back to you, Ayanda Mhlongo.
Well, thanks very much there to my colleague Vusi Khumalo in Umlazi. Of course, just getting views of community members on the ground, more specifically the hawkers or informal traders, on the impact of the July unrest. It's a year later, and just hearing them talk about the challenges that they've experienced over the past year, saying they relied on that wholesaler and business and people then coming out to buy from them. And that is just one area across the province of KwaZulu-Natal. In fact, there are small towns that were completely destroyed, and up till this day very, very difficult for communities living in those rural towns. Of course, today we are focused largely here in the city of Durban, and for our viewers who may have just joined us, we are coming to you live from KwaMashu, from the Bridge City shopping complex, which is by far, I think, one of the biggest, if not the biggest shopping centers here in the area of KwaMashu, centrally located, of course, so that it can service the communities of Inanda, Duzuma, KwaMashu, as well as even neighboring areas of Bambai, Amawoti and Phoenix. And as you can see behind us, of course, construction has started. It is underway to try and repair this mall, which was completely ravaged and parts of it gutted. We're continuing with our conversation with the MEC for Economic Development in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, Mr. Ravi Pillay, and of course my colleague Simphiwe Makhanya. MEC, I was listening to Vusi speak to informal traders, and I know that we've been speaking earlier on about big business and where big business are at this point. We've also spoken about jobs, which are quite critical considering the current economic situation. But the small and informal traders also play a really big role in this economic chain, and they are saying that it's been a year and they're reliant on shopping centers like this. Let's speak to the support that has been given to informal traders. I mean, in this area, I would know that on any given day before the destruction, there were hundreds of informal traders. The question is, where are they now? Speak to us about the support that has been given to informal traders, and where are you in terms of that?
Well, thank you. I think firstly, institutionally, we recognize the informal sector as a specific sector requiring target attention. So if you look at our economic recovery plan, we've disaggregated our economy into 14 sectors, We're quite happy that we have a diversified economy, but that's a subject for another time. But one of those 14 is informal sectors, where we want to give it targeted attention, primarily through our municipalities, because they are at the coalface of that interaction. So from regulatory issues, in terms of permits, in terms of actual relief, I believe that we had a specific fund of over 30 million, which was implemented by Trade and Investment KwaZulu-Natal. It was part of the national package, but the majority of the beneficiaries there were informal traders. And of course the amounts were small, from 10,000 Rand average, but for that informal trader, that's a significant amount. You can replace the stock, any other infrastructure that was damaged. In addition to that, we want to really focus on infrastructure. So throughout the province, I think we currently have about 15 projects dealing with informal infrastructure. In some areas like Mhlabelingana, the entire informal center was destroyed, so we got to rebuild that. So from Nongoma to the south to Kokstad, we are concentrating on investing in that particular infrastructure. So we're very, the informal economy is much more than the informal traders as a sector. And I keep saying that in a country like India, 50% of the employment comes from the informal sector. So we've got to give much more focused attention. Of course, there's a balance to be struck between the interests of informal traders and formal businesses. Formal businesses complain that they have to pay rates, they have to pay rent, lights and water, but they have somebody on the street competing with them with the same item. So that's a balance that we've got to strike. But broadly speaking, in response to your question, it's a specific sector, an important sector. We want to build much stronger relationships and direct resources effectively for their growth and protection.
And I know, MEC, we've been focusing a lot on business, and my questions earlier on from my colleague Simphiwe to you this morning, we've touched a lot on business, but you are of course here representing the KwaZulu-Natal government. And I want to move on to another a point of discussion now, and that is the scars from the unrest. We know that there were areas that tensions were high, racial tensions were high in particular areas. I know government has been working closely with certain stakeholders, with churches, with civil society organizations to try and rebuild relations in certain communities. And I know that the great deal of focus has been on the Phoenix, Amawo, Dipambai area, but it's not just that area where these discussions and programs are ongoing. Speak to us about the progress that has been made there to try and rebuild these communities.
No, thank you. I think it's a very important point. I think it was a shock to many people. I mean, it was a huge shock that in the so many years after democracy, we could have manifestations of such racial tension and intolerance. And you're quite correct, while the bigger, damaging, devastating incidents, loss of lives might have happened in specific areas in the main, the ripple effect was throughout the province in terms of its effect on race relations. I think we've recovered significantly. We're not quite there. The wounds are deep. Will require constant nurturing for a healing. I think the Premier has been leading from the front on that particular issue, talking to communities from all sides, creating specific programs that will contribute to, in fact, we want to move away from the word social cohesion. We think nation building is a more practical expression of the work that we want to do. So that work is ongoing. We're very pleased with the work of the religious sector and civil society formations that on the ground, I mean, I've seen people focusing on sports programs and getting young people to play together. And then of course on the gender side there's been many programs, and of course on the religious side I think they're doing some very, very significant work. So I think we can't pretend that we've solved that completely. I think we've got to work at it. I think there's an acknowledgement that we can't have ad hoc programs. In many ways, nation building needs to be institutionalized, even in our school syllabus, and be consistently done, and not just fragmented and ad hoc whenever we're responding to a crisis. So we're hoping that some of the reports that are still to come out are going to reflect on that particular aspect and give more holistic guidance to it. But indeed, you are correct. and the social cohesion programs, I'm still using that word, those term, because that's the formal name of the program. And we need to massify that effort in a much more serious way.
Speaking of the deep wounds, MEC, that still need to heal in our society, I mean, one of the issues that I'm thinking about now is that our provincial government has been, giving different messages with regards to what really happened in the area of Phoenix. For instance, the Premier called it a massacre, but you chose to use a different term. Why?
Well, I think that's the point we're making, is that a lot of the facts are not completely known. I see just yesterday or today there was a report on the number of people who died, and then versus the actual number who died because of violent action, and there's a huge disparity. So I think one of the points being made is that, yes, overall, I think there's a particular impression, but there's a lot of the detail of what happened, where, when, and how, that's still not quite in the public domain. So we're hoping that processes like the Human Rights Commission work and other bodies that have been seized with it will be able to come out with a much more evidence-backed conclusions and recommendations, for which obviously will be very much more important.
You link to how do we classify what happened at Simphiwe, and today I suppose MEC, as we're saying, we are reflecting. We need to move on. We need to draw lessons from what happened. Society wants to move on. In many areas where people went out and looted, there's been this change of attitude, the change of mindset, to people now taking a step back to say, you know what, it shouldn't have happened. We are now feeling the consequences of it. While those may have been people that were actively part of the looting and those that suffered, but of course we've got the real victims of this. And I just wanted to get, MEC, from a province, what are you getting from law enforcement agencies? You meet with them as a province. What reports, are you satisfied with the reports that is coming from the police? They said 12 instigators. To this day, in order for people to move forward, they are saying we need to find closure. And how do we find closure? We get justice. And we need to know who was behind this unrest. Till this day, MEC, as a leader of government in KwaZulu-Natal, representing the Premier, of course, do you know who was responsible for this violence, and what are you getting from the police?
Look, I'll draw a distinction between what happened then in July last year and the immediate aftermath versus what is happening now. And that's very important in terms of the moving forward message. As far as what is happening, what happened and the investigations that have taken place in the 12 or 17 arrests, I think the jury is still out as to what they charged with and what they're going to be convicted of. But I haven't seen anything yet that talks to the point that you are making in terms of overall coordination or instigation. I think we even noted that a formal statement by the deputy head of the NPA to say that they have not seen any such evidence, but of course it doesn't mean it's not there. It means it just hasn't reached the NPA. And of course there's also that famous saying that the absence of evidence is not proof of its absence. So sometimes it takes a bit of time before these things emerge. But there's been enough anecdotal and not more than anecdotal, a massive body of evidence that spoke to a consistent, over time, instigate. The use of social media, I mean, that was not accidental. And some of those sites were clearly designed to stoke and provoke and instigate. But we'll have to give the investigators time, and I'm sure there'll be much more research, more that will be done over time to point us to the correct conclusion. Because the judicial process is a judicial process according to the best standards, world standards, and so it has to satisfy a particular level of evidence in order to lead to a prosecution and conviction phase. But I draw the distinction between what is happening now, because even then I saw firsthand how the police were stretched. They didn't have resources. In their tactical assessment, they had to devote it to what they call national key points, leaving communities on the ground without any significant presence. I think we learned lessons about how there should be coordination between the police and neighborhood watches or community police forums in a more effective way. I heard just yesterday the police commissioner making the point. These are enhancing mechanisms of community participation but perhaps you need to have one policeman there with a team of 20 or 30, so that one policeman ensures discipline and compliance with the law, but you achieve the purpose. So those are the practical kind of solutions I think that we must come up with and emerge. But coming back to now, I think we've seen significant difference in the preparation of the police, the swift action of the police when threats arise. I think you recall not too long ago, on the 10th of June, there was a threat of a national shutdown. It didn't take place, and not because some people didn't want it to take place, but because the countermeasures that were put in place were effective, both politically in terms of the messaging to communities, but also from the security cluster in terms of their preparations and responses.
Right, MEC, thank you so much for joining us this morning and just obviously sharing with us government's position on where we are in terms of rebuilding, as we're seeing just here, evidence of this mall being rebuilt, but of course also speaking about other programs, of course, to try and recover both in business and for our society sort of get back to that place of normality. Still, of course, many questions that remain in the areas that we have visited in the past year, and more especially in the days leading up to today, when we look back on that unfortunate week of devastation, of mass riots, of protests, of looting. The people on the ground want answers. They still want answers which are going to ensure that we do not find ourselves in a similar situation any other time. We're going to leave it here for now, but of course our rolling coverage of today's 1 year since the July unrest continues. Desiree, back to you.
Absolutely, Ayanda. Will continue to talk about these conversations, particularly that part that really pains South Africans, where investigations are not really yielding that much fruit. Let's take you to this.